Morning guys, I'm back. Right, on to chapter 4 of Beetle Boy. Now hopefully Rowling have caught up with us because we're going to be doing some work on this book this week. So make sure you've watched all the videos. Go back to the first chapter if you've forgotten. Shouldn't take you too long to listen to because we're not very far in. Okay, so chapter 4, the entomology vaults. Darkus took out his key and opened Uncle Max's front door, climbing the 3 flights of stairs to the attic. "This is my room, Baxter," he said, turning on the light and walking to the photo hanging on the wall. "That's my dad. You'll like him. He's always telling me not to squash insects." He stared at the picture in silence for a moment. "He says you should never take a life, no matter how small. He won't even let me kill the slugs in the garden." The beetle's wing sheaths flickered open and closed rapidly. The insect seemed oddly overexcited, and Darkus moved away in case the too giant dimensional human face was frightening the beetle. "I sleep here," he pointed at the hammock, and that's it really. It's small, but it's better than living up somebody's trouser leg. He sat down on the floor, putting the beetle on the makeshift table and leaning in to study it closely. It was pretty hairy in places, and its armour-plated underbelly reminded Darkus of a crab's. Its front legs had hinged kneecaps, but its back legs were chunkier and stretched out almost in a straight line. The beetle suffered the inspection, staring back at him unblinking. Darkus had never been afraid of insects, but it hadn't occurred to him that you might have one as a pet. He wondered if Uncle Max would let him keep the beetle. It was pretty cool, and he'd liked how it had felt when Baxter was sitting on his shoulder. "Come on," he scooped up the beetle. "Let's go down to the kitchen and find out what you eat." "I'm home," Uncle Max's voice came up the stairs. "In the kitchen," Darkus called back, picking Baxter up off the table. "Good news," Uncle Max cried as he burst into the room. "I've got us an appointment at the museum." He stopped speaking when he saw what Darkus was holding in his hands. "What's that?" "It's a beetle," Darkus lifted it up. "Isn't it cool?" Uncle Max stared at the insect and then at Darkus. "Where did you get it?" "In the street. It climbed onto my hand." Darkus pulled his hands into his chest protectively, surprised by the tone of his uncle's voice. "I tried to let it go, but it won't leave me alone. It seems to like me." "Here? Outside in the street?" Uncle Max's shoulders dropped and he seemed to relax a bit. "Yeah, just crawling around all on its own." Darkus looked at the floor. He felt bad not telling his uncle the whole truth. "How strange." Uncle Max's voice sounded distant, as if he was thinking about something troubling. "What did you say about the museum?" Darkus asked, changing the subject. "Ah, yes." Uncle Max's finger shot up into the air. "Tomorrow, my lad, you and I are going to take a look inside that damned vault." "Really?" Darkus's heart leapt. "What about school?" "Hang school." Uncle Max swiped the air in front of his face. "Bart is more important." "Yes," Darkus nodded. "He is." Uncle Max narrowed his eyes, looking at the insect Darkus was clutching to his chest. "I wonder who the beetle belongs to," he said. "Well, perhaps it doesn't belong to anyone." "There'll most certainly be an owner, my lad. A rhinoceros beetle like that one." "A rhinoceros beetle?" Darkus put the beetle back down on the table and looked at his uncle. "That's the common name for the horned beauty like that chap." Uncle Max leant over. "I must say he's a handsome specimen, and you can tell he is a he because females don't have the tusk." He pointed with his little finger. "He's not a native Londoner. He's probably from the Amazon or the Far East. You'd pay a pretty penny to buy him in a pet shop, and even then—" Uncle Max's forehead creased. "I'm not sure it's legal to trade in this species." "Can I keep him?" Darkus asked, pleading with his eyes. "Someone might be out looking for him." "Please? If anyone comes knocking saying they've lost a rhinoceros beetle, you'll have to give him back." "I know, I will, I promise." Darkus held his breath, hoping. Well, please say yes." There was a long pause, and Darkus thought he might burst. "I suppose he can stay with us for now." Uncle Max's frown melted as Darkus's sombre face was transformed by a smile. "I suppose a pet would be good company for you whilst I'm at the university." He sighed. "Have you already given him a name?" Darkus nodded. "Baxter, like the soup." "I like the sound of that." Uncle Max nodded his approval. "It's a good name for a beetle." "I've never had a pet before." Darkus gazed happily at Baxter. "Thank you." "That's all right, lad." Uncle Max threw his hands up in defeat. "I can hardly say no when I know that Barty would have said yes." Darkus looked up, surprised. "He would?" "Of course. A handsome hexapod like this, he'd have been do-lally about it." Darkus frowned. His dad cared greatly about the environment, recycling everything and using minimal energy. He watched birds in the spring and grew vegetables for their dinner table, often lecturing him on the benefits of spiders, but not once, ever, could Darkus remember him talking about liking beetles. "What do you mean?" "Oh, sorry, a hexapod is a creature with 6 legs. No, I mean what you said about Dad being doolally about Baxter." Well, it's obvious. Barty's obsessed with beetles. Uncle Max seemed perplexed by the confusion on Darcus's face. And Baxter, well, I haven't seen a finer specimen, so it's only natural that he would be crazy about... His voice petered out. Dad's obsessed with beetles? Darcus felt odd inside as he watched his uncle realise that this was something he didn't know. Doesn't he ever take you insect hunting? Uncle Max asked weakly. No. Darcus shook his head and searched his memory for any time that his dad had talked to him about insects. He tells me I shouldn't kill spiders, though. Oh, well, I suppose it was a long time ago. Perhaps he grew out of it. We were kids, after all. Uncle Max looked deeply uncomfortable. And he's right, you shouldn't kill spiders. As he and his uncle stared at each other across the table, it dawned on Darcus that he'd stumbled upon some kind of secret, and he didn't know what to say. He couldn't think why liking beetles would be something Dad should keep from him, and the fact that his dad had secrets stung inside. Uncle Max slid his chair back from the table and disappeared out of the room without saying a word. Darcus took a deep breath and blinked back tears. He'd had the best day in ages, making friends with Virginia and Bertolt, and then finding Baxter, and now suddenly he felt horrible again. Uncle Max was back, clutching an old red book with a gold stag beetle embossed on the cover. If you're going to look after Baxter properly, you'll need this. He slid it across the table. Darcus opened the cover. It was a fragile old book, and some of the pages were loose. The title page said The Beetle Collector's Handbook. In the top right corner, in a child's handwriting, was written, Bartholomew Cuttle, aged 9. Flicking through the pages, Darcus saw the book listed the various families of beetle and had colour pictures on pages protected by tissue paper. He found an illustration of a rhinoceros beetle and looked up at Uncle Max. Dad loves beetles. Uncle Max nodded. Ever since he was a boy, he's been fascinated by them. Darcus looked at the rhinoceros beetle sitting quietly on the table. I am too. Barty became something of an expert. He worked in the field for a while. You can become an expert on beetles? Darcus had never heard of such a job. Uncle Max laughed and nodded. Then that's what I'm going to do. Darcus closed the book and hugged it to his chest. Uncle Max ran his hand over the top of Darcus's stubbly head. You may look like your mother, but you're just like Barty. But I don't understand. Why didn't he tell me? That's not for me to say, lad. It was a long time ago before you were born. You'll have to ask your father about it when we find him. Uncle Max leant down and opened the cupboard below the sink, lifting out a rectangular fish tank. Now, when I was young, I was crazy about terrapins. I had 2, Howard and Carter. Adorable fellows. And this, he set the aquarium down on the table, was their home. He scratched at a crust of algae with his thumb. It needs a bit of a clean, but it might make a good home for a beetle. For Baxter? Darcus stood up. Yes, Uncle Max smiled. Darcus carefully placed the red book in the tank and wrapped his arms around it, lifting it against his chest. Thank you, we'll wash it right away, won't we, Baxter? Careful, it's heavy. I've got it. Darcus shuffled towards the door. Come on, Baxter. Baxter's wings rattled like helicopter blades as he lifted off the kitchen table and landed neatly on Darcus's shoulder. Uncle Max's jaw dropped open. Good Lord. I know, Darcus said from the hall. He looks too heavy to fly, doesn't he? The door closed, leaving Uncle Max standing in the middle of the kitchen, stunned. He rubbed his hands over his face and sat down, his mind reeling. He'd seen a beetle respond to a human command once before, many years ago in Bartholomew's laboratory, and he'd done his best to forget it had ever happened. He shook his head. He must have imagined it. What with all the talk about Barty and his past, he was getting jumpy. Barty had promised Esme he'd never go back to the abominable work he'd done for the Faber project. But Esme was dead, and if his brother had returned to his research, what did that mean? Was it connected to his sudden disappearance? Max looked up at the ceiling. None of this made any sense. If Darcus's rhinoceros beetle had anything to do with the Faber project, how did it come to be on Nelson Parade? And the project had been shut down for over 10 years now. Professor Applegard was retired, for goodness sake. He was imagining things. The beetle couldn't have been responding to Darcus. It was just following him out of the room. But even that, Max knew, went against the behavioural patterns of an insect. The next morning, dressed in his green jumper and jeans, Darcus scrambled into the passenger seat of his uncle's car, carefully placing his backpack at his feet. The car's a bit of a banger, I'm afraid. Uncle Max turned the key in the ignition for the 4th time, but once she's cleared her throat, she fires up like a Ferrari. On the 5th attempt, the engine roared into life, and the mint-green Renault 4 bunny-hopped forwards. Whoops, Uncle Max chuckled. Handbrake. He released the handbrake and stamped on the clutch, grinding through the gears as he pulled out into the road. I've persuaded Eddie to let us into the vaults, he said, leaning over the steering wheel to check the road was clear before accelerating across the junction. Darcus knew Eddie from visits in the school holidays. He was the security guard on duty when Dad had disappeared. He always had a smile for Darcus and a bag of sweets in his pocket. Margaret is going to meet us and unlock the room Barty disappeared from. Uncle Max looked at Darcus. You remember Margaret? Darcus nodded. Margaret was his father's very bosomy, overly perfumed secretary. Marvellous girl, he chuckled. She used to have a bit of a thing for me when I was a younger man. Ugh, Darcus grimaced. Now, we need to keep our heads down, Uncle Max continued, ignoring Darcus, because the museum, or rather Mr. Langley, the museum director, wasn't overly keen to have us look in those vaults. We're sneaking in? Well, let's just say this isn't an official visit, Uncle Max grinned. But there's nothing to worry about. We archaeologists are always venturing into places uninvited. I flatter myself I'm pretty good at it. Why won't Mr. Langley let us in? I'm not sure, Uncle Max frowned. He waffled on about the police having done a thorough search and the rooms being restricted access. To be honest, I stopped listening when I realised he wasn't going to say yes. Eddie and Margaret were much more helpful. They parked a couple of streets away from the museum and walked in through the main entrance, like any family on a day trip. Eddie was waiting for them beside a cafe on the ground floor. He was standing in his uniform in front of a door signposted "No Entry." "Hello, Edward, how are you?" Uncle Max asked, shaking his hand. "I'm very well, thank you, Professor." Eddie grinned at Darcus and rubbed his hand across his head. "What happened to your hair, son? Had a fight with a lawnmower?" "Hi, Eddie." Darcus smiled shyly. "Something like that, yeah." "You look like a hedgehog," Eddie said, offering him a boiled sweet from the bag in his pocket. "Thanks." Darcus took the sweet. "I mean, for doing this, letting us see the vault." "No bother, son." Eddie shook his head. "Terrible strange business. Glad to be able to help." They followed him through the door and down a flight of stairs into the belly of the building, where Bartholomew Cuddle's personal secretary, Margaret Dingle, was waiting for them. Uncle Max lifted his safari hat. "Good of you to help us with this, Maggie." "Not at all, Max." Margaret blushed. "You know I'd do anything for Barty." She grabbed Darcus's shoulders. "Now, young man, I'm sure you're too old for a hug, but that's not going to stop me." She smothered him with her mauve cardigan and then grabbed his chin. "Let me look at you. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Darcus reassured her, untangling himself. "Uncle Max is looking after me great." "Are you feeding the child properly, Max? He looks thin. And what have you done to his hair?" "He's always been thin," Uncle Max huffed. "Now stop fussing over the poor boy and let's have a look at this room my brother magically disappeared from." "This is the one Bartholomew was in." Margaret pulled a set of keys from her handbag and walked to the third of 6 grey metal doors. "Are these rooms private?" Uncle Max asked, following her. "The collection is open to researchers and academics, but only by appointment with the director of the museum. Occasionally we'll exhibit parts of it to the public, but it's too big for one exhibition." Above the door was a wooden plaque with the words "The Cutter Coleoptera Collection" engraved in gold. Uncle Max pointed at the plaque. "Would that be Lucretia Cutter?" he asked, his face draining of colour. "Mm-hmm," Margaret nodded, unlocking the door. "She's a great patron of the museum. She sponsors the Coleoptera collection. The Natural History Museum has the largest collection in the world, and it costs a lot to take care of it." Darcus had never heard of Lucretia Cutter, but he could see from the expression on his uncle's face that she was bad news. Part 2 in a moment.